is Dr. Kat O'Neill. I am a Principal Lecturer for Research and Knowledge Exchange at Teesside University. I've done a little bit of work around in-work poverty, and what we mean is that people are working but they're still really struggling. So they're struggling with decisions around what they're going to prioritise in terms of money. They're not feeling like they've got enough to live a fulfilling life. You know, they can be really struggling and making impossible decisions. So it's defined in lots of different ways, actually. Some people do it based on an income threshold. So if it's below a certain income, it's classed as in-work poverty if you're below a certain income and still working. Others, it's to do with certain benefit entitlements. There's lots of different ways that you can define it, basically. And we did a piece of work that was specifically, we did two pieces of work. One was looking at parents, single parents particularly, and their experiences of in-work poverty. And we also looked at frontline workers in the voluntary and community sector and asked them about their experiences of in-work poverty as well. And yeah, we found some interesting findings from that. What we found was, so some of the stories we collected, one was the both parents were working, so both parents working full time, but working on a minimum wage or very low paid jobs. And it's it's kind of a combination of factors. So there's something around the low wages, so the wages that they're getting are not sufficient to kind of manage all the needs. It could be if they've got high rents or high mortgage payments, the cost of living crisis, everything has gone up in terms of petrol, in terms of food, like in terms of your utilities, etc. So it's like a perfect storm for families. And that's just your basic, very, very basic needs. What we were finding was these aren't just families, in poverty that are on benefits and things. This is people who are working full time. It could be, people that we work with as colleagues. They're struggling to pay the bare minimum. They might be able to pay the bare minimum, but then they're not left with very much else to do anything else with. But yeah, we also saw occasions where there was families where both parents were working, and it was contributing towards children that were involved in antisocial behaviour in the communities because of the parents not being able to be available, and the parents are faced with an impossible choice because they had to work in order to have a roof over their heads, in order to pay the bills, in order to pay for food, and yet and sometimes they were getting involvement from the school or social services saying, why aren't you there for your children? But at the same time they were like, if we're not there, then we can't pay our bills. So parents are often in these impossible dilemmas between, do I pay for my child's school uniform? School uniforms, we found some of them, you're looking at £400, £500, £600 to buy a full school uniform. We've got schools that have got branded PE kits, where you have to buy a particular skirt with a logo on, or you have to buy, a huge range of different branded items, and from a particular, you can't buy it from Asda or one of the more low cost places. You have to buy it from a specific, school stockist. And there's probably good reasons for that, like in terms of, sense of pride and things like that, but it's making it very, very difficult for families to outlay things like that. The other thing is, so even if you can cover the bare minimums, which you would hope you could if you're both working, we all know there isn't just bare minimums in life, so I had to buy a new oven this week because my oven's dead. Next month it could be, last month my car was breaking down. My car, like I'm a university lecturer, my car's on its last legs. I'm driving a 15-year-old car. I think everything costs so much money, and those unexpected costs come up more often than you'd imagine. And all it takes is one or two of them a month, and it's eating up all available extra funds. And one of the things that really struck me about the interviews we were doing with frontline workers was this idea of being just over the threshold. So for some, that we would hope that there is support for people in the most desperate situations, but if you just above the threshold for support, you might be like only earning £500 more than somebody that's getting support, or a tiny little bit more, but then there's no support available. So those people are really, really struggling in that in between space. And every month, I've spoken to people where it's like, I can't afford to buy a toilet roll. I can't afford to put diesel in my car to attend my client appointments because I've got to drive over to Hartlepool or I've got to drive over somewhere else. I'm going to have to call in sick for work because I can't get to the appointment. So it's, and I've sat in rooms with people where, sorry, I'm just going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I've sat in rooms with people where we've talked about in work poverty, and their suggestions were things like, why don't we do cooking lessons for them? Teach them how to budget. I'm like, there could be people in this room that are in this situation that are working in services. It's not about a lack of education. It's about the impossible choices that people are having to make, basically, in order to just live a basic life, not even an extravagant life. This isn't about having, needing to have 3 holidays a year or something. It's about being able to fund the absolute minimum that you need to live and the additional expenses that you need to live. If you don't have a car, you can't get to work, you can't get certain jobs, especially if you live in a rural location. So with poverty, I think there can be a real othering of people, of saying like, oh, this is those poor people over there. This is people I know, this is friends, this is family, this is people that are struggling to just get through each month. And it really does cause a lot of stress. What came through from our interviews was just how desperate it is sometimes, that they don't, we've got some great services available for people, and it's difficult, isn't it, because you might have people in absolute poverty who aren't earning an income and can't even meet the basic necessities, and that obviously they're going to be a priority area, definitely, for sure. But yeah, if the people who don't get access to half clubs, so they don't get any childcare support, and if you're working over the summer, you've got a huge break where you've got to find childcare, which is another huge expense, or you've got to take the time off, and that's a huge anxiety for people. Straight after that, you've got school uniforms to pay for, which could be that huge, like £400, £500, £600 expenditure if you've got one child. If you've got more than one child, if you're a single parent, you might have a single income, and then you're trying to do all of that within that's an intense amount of pressure on those people. And one of the things that they said in the interview is that we want a spotlight on this issue because it's not being raised, it's not being seen, and there's good reasons, I guess, for that. But at the same time, there is a group of people that are, one of the ladies was saying, everyone I know is on antidepressants. All my colleagues, they're really stressed out. We're trying our best to help each other out, but the direct impact on mental health of ongoing stresses is significant. And if you're in hardship, you're constantly carrying that weight of what's going to happen next. How am I going to pay for this? How am I going to buy the next thing? My kids, and one of the things that the parents were telling them was like how challenging it is when the kids come and they say, I want this, mum, like everyone else has got. And you're like, we can't afford it. Why can't we afford it? Like, and then having to deal with the pain of not being able to give your kids what you want, especially if you've, like, I remember speaking to one lady who'd grown up in poverty herself, and she'd made it her mission to never be in that situation. So she'd worked and had a really good job, working really hard, and was still finding herself in that situation. So it was so demoralizing because she was like, I never wanted my kids to be in that situation, and I'm working and doing everything I can, and yet I can't give them what they need, to feel like they're living a comfortable life. So I don't want anyone feeling like because they've come from a certain background doesn't mean, that they're going to have adverse life chances and stuff. I don't think it's fair to say that. Lots of people do go on and have a really positive life, and it can help people to, strive more and grow in different ways. Saying that, like, if you look at things like the Marmot report, where you've got, looking at the outcomes for children over the course of a lifespan, we know that poverty has a negative and compounded effect from pre-birth onwards, throughout a person's life course, in terms of lots of different health outcomes like physical health, mental health, etc. It can impact on people's self-esteem, their sense of worth. But again, it's not everybody. It's not, we're not saying that will happen, but there is definitely a correlation between, living in experiences of poverty and, potential for the compounding of long-term adverse outcomes, which is partly why it's so important to intervene with young people. I think like that was the whole rationale for Sure Starts. So if you look, I mean, everybody loves Sure Starts, don't they? But there's really good evidence to show that, like in terms of the outcomes for young people, programs like Sure Start, which were based on Marmot's work, I believe, were in order to get in early and stop that kind of compounding effect. It was a universal service, but it benefited people who were in the worst position most. So actually, like those kind of universal services that benefit everybody will also really benefit people who are struggling, but without stigmatizing them. And I think that's the challenge now, is a lot of our services are very targeted at particular communities, which means if you're just over the threshold, you're not going to get that support. But also it's, I know people in my own family that when they were on free school meals, they were embarrassed in school having to be on free school meals, and also that it didn't quite cover the full amount, to get a nice kind of pop, or like get, when you're a teenager, those things matter. And so there's a lot of stigma there around those things, which can start to impact on how you feel. I guess one of the things that did come out of our research, because it's not just a doom and gloom story, and I think it's important that we don't other like communities and also just go in with a deficit model, because actually, like you were saying earlier, people are incredibly resourceful, resilient. Like some of the stories I heard was like, kids starting their own business in schools, selling sweets or playing 2P games against the wall, and like, finding their own creative ways around these situations. We heard stories about communities coming together and helping each other out, like sharing resources and, just thinking about how they can make lives better for each other. So there is strength in our communities, and there's something about how we approach communities in this issue. That this is what I was trying to get at with this, like, this isn't someone else, it's us kind of mindset, is like, this is a problem that we need to deal with as a society, and it's not happening to a particular pocket of people. It's something that's happening not to everybody, obviously, but to a greater or lesser extent, lots of people are being affected by this, and we should be empowering communities, seeing the strength, seeing their resilience, and then looking to support more action from the bottom up. One of the lady that I was speaking about, who was really upset that she couldn't give her son, the things that she wanted to give him, being a single parent. But she was also saying that she couldn't, this was something that came out of those interviews that I wasn't aware of, but was people not reporting issues to landlords. So when they're in, like, private landlords, they don't report if the boiler's broken, if there's problems with the windows. They don't report, like, if there's mold on the windows, because they don't want to be seen as a bad tenant. So if they start costing the landlord money in terms of repairs, then they might be there's a fear that they might be classed as a bad tenant, and then they get moved on because there's no security in terms of their accommodation. So they're living with this constant anxiety that they could lose their home if they can't keep up payments, or if they raise kind of really legitimate issues that are wrong with the quality of the standard of the property. And I was really surprised by that. But imagine it yourself, like if you were living in a house where you could lose it at any moment, there was no protections in terms of like your accommodation. Sometimes you're living in poor quality housing and you don't want to raise it. That's not only a sort of psychological stressor of not knowing, you're always thinking, how are we going to pay for this, how are we going to pay for that, how are we going to survive this month, are we going to keep the same house? Imagine living with that all the time. That's something that's going to be weighing on your mind all the time. That's going to gradually have an impact on your mental health. It's just an extra. The way I like to think of it is like our stress levels are like a glass of water, and things fill your glass up, don't they, throughout the day. If you're living in like insecure housing, poor quality housing, and living in financial hardship, whether you're working or not, that's filling your glass up quite a lot before you even get to the ordinary stresses and strains of life. So it's not going to take that much for your stress levels to overflow, just from kind of less things that you might have been able to cope with if you weren't in that other situation, if you weren't in such a challenging situation. So we're all living with our glasses not half full in a good way, but half filled up with stresses. So it's not taking much to overwhelm. And if you look at mental health services now, a lot of the issues that people are coming with aren't just about mental health. It's always like complex social factors as well. So you're looking at, insecure housing, you're looking at antisocial behaviour, you're looking at, there's loads of stuff going on for people that's just filling those glasses up and up and up. And that obviously has a knock-on effect on how easy it is for your mental health to be, deteriorated. I think one of the things that you sometimes see is, first of all, there's the othering. So this is poor people. They're not in this room, or they're different to us somehow, or this isn't our friends, our families. This is this other group of people. So that's one thing. I think these like simplistic ideas that, oh, we just need to do budgeting classes, or there might be something in it about access to services. There might be something about people knowing their rights, knowing how to get financial advice. Things like that might be part of the solution. But I think things like, you know, cooking classes or budgeting classes as a very simplistic solution to this systemic problem are just not the most helpful solution. They might be part of the solution, but they're not the sole solution. And I think one of the challenges is that as a professional group, as a sector, as a country, to try and deal with the issues, it's much easier, isn't it, if we can say this is the problem, this is the solution. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. This is the problem, but there's loads of things that would need to change in order to actually make a big difference to people's quality of lives, and they're all interconnected. So yeah, that would be the biggest misconception, I guess, is like that there is a simple answer and that we can just do it quickly. This is something that has to be coordinated from lots of different parts of society, and that we'd have to work really carefully to kind of implement. We did some work with some kids. What I noticed we did focus groups with them. They were so focused on like having the right clothes and the right brands, and what really made me think was like that it's, and because they were like, oh, they've got some nice hoodies in Primark, but I wouldn't dare wear them. Wouldn't dare wear a hoodie from Primark. For the non-borough people, wouldn't dare is like one of our colloquialisms. But like, it's like, you know for them it was, if poverty was almost like the worst thing you could be accused of, whereas in some of the rural communities that wasn't the issue that was coming through for young people. They were worried about like exam stress, or like, you know problems with friends, but it wasn't this kind of theme of like having to have the right trainers. Oh, I wouldn't wear fakies, I'd get it ripped out of me if I was wearing like fake stuff. So it wasn't even just having the branded stuff. Like, one of the things that really came through so strong was like, you have to have it branded. That is like a status symbol. It's like, if you don't have the right trainers, the right bags, the right like branded items, then you are poor, and that means that's shameful, and you will get bullied for it, basically. And it was much more apparent in like some of the inner city, well, it's not city, but the inner town kind of communities than the more rural ones. So I think shame and stigma is absolutely something that people experience.
Different social currency in it, our young people and also adults.
Yeah,
Adults carried that as well, I think.
absolutely. Well, that's like the man was saying. So the kids really feeling the need that I have to have branded items, otherwise I'm going to get bullied and shamed at school. And then the mum who's working, and trying never to be in poverty that she experienced, and then she can't buy it for a kid, and then a kid's giving her a hard time because they're going to get a hard time at school. Then it impacts on their family relationships as well. And the mum feeling so, oh, sorry, I'm touching the mic, but feeling so much guilt and, not feeling great because she can't do that for her kids. It's so difficult. When we looked at it from a local area, like a hyper-local perspective, like things like transport is key in some of this stuff. So some of the interviews we did was like, there was families that were trying to encourage the next generation to work. So this was grandparents to grandchildren. The parents might not have worked, or they might have been kinship carers or similar, and they're trying to instill a work ethic in their young people. So transport is key, and it compounds poverty, transport. So when we were doing some work, the Lloyds Bank Foundation did a piece of work on in-work poverty in Redcar and Cleveland. And one of the things that came up is like, if you live in East Cleveland, you're quite geographically isolated in like rural communities, then you're not only struggling to get to work, you've got less choice in the jobs that you do. You might struggle for employment, but you also got less choice in the shops that you go to. So you might only be able to go to your local shop that has more expensive products. You can't go to your Aldi's, you can't go to your Lidl's and make choices in it. So the lack of transport doesn't just impact on the roles you do, but it also impacts on the sort of choices that you've got in terms of expenses. So I think transport is something that has to be examined, and the accessibility of transport for people, because it gives people more freedom. I mean, we didn't mention HS2 and all of that kind of stuff, but I guess the idea behind it from some of the literature I've looked at is that the northeast itself is very geographically isolated as a place, even without just looking at Teesside as a microcosm of that. And you know, there's less economic opportunity when you're more geographically isolated because you've got less opportunity to travel to better job opportunities. And I think I'm not an expert in like free market capitalism, but like my basic like lay understanding of economics is that the idea is that people can move where the money is, but that kind of belies this, you know, fact that people have real lives, they have community connections, they have parental support networks. Perhaps if they've got kids, they need family support around them, so that there isn't always the geographic mobility. So we need to invest more in connecting up places, especially geographically isolated places, thinking about transport. I would say that's another area that's really important when it comes to poverty. If you've got people working who can't afford to put petrol in the car to go to the client appointments, like, you know, I mean, I talked to people and they were saying, oh, what we're doing in our team is we're carpooling. So we've started like trying to share, and then we share lunches. But isn't it sad that, like, you know, you're working, you're doing a really important job, often in the community, working with others, and you're having to like you can't even have lunch. Like, you can't bring your own lunch. You're having to like, oh well, let's pool our. It's a lovely creative idea, isn't it? Like, let's pool our resources. We'll help each other out. But shouldn't it also be that, you know, if you're working, you paid enough to live a reasonable life? Like, that's not that much to ask, is it? And that was one of the things that came out of our interviews. Was there was one of the themes was called "What's the point?" Because if you're in work and you're working and you're trying your best, but you're still just meeting the bare minimum, why bother? Like, people were getting to that point where they were like, why am I busting my head in, like, in a really stressful job where everything's falling apart and I'm running myself ragged to try and like do what's needed for the community and for, you know, for earning a living, but actually I don't feel any further ahead. You know, I'm just surviving. Even in my grandparents' generation, even though they were poor, you know, people could survive on a single wage. You know, you can't families can't survive on a single wage now unless you're very, very wealthy. Like, it's really difficult. We can become paralyzed by the complexity as well. That's the other thing, is that we shouldn't not start just because it's hard. So even if we have to pull a single thread, it's just acknowledging that there's a much bigger picture there, but at least we could start with one thing, you know, and then hopefully it unravels. So, because that's the other thing, is people can get into a really powerless mindset, like there's nothing they can do, but actually, like, there's always something that you can do. You know, I've seen, like, I'm a massive advocate of like asset-based community development and working with communities for them to come up with their own creative solutions. You know, often doesn't cost that much, you know, to really empower. And everyone's like jumping on that bandwagon at the moment because I think there's no money and everyone's suddenly like, we need new ideas that don't cost loads of money. Let's go to the community, you know. but like, it's not a bad, you know, whatever the reason behind it, it's not a bad approach, because actually people are incredibly resilient and innovative and, you know, entrepreneurial, and we want to find ways to tackle this problem that come from people who are living with that problem, and those people are us. You know, I think a lot of people, when there was fuel poverty, they all said, right, we'll set up warm spaces, you know, for people. And my understanding, although, you know, it might be different in other places, but certainly in our community, is nobody used them, or very few people used the warm spaces. Maybe because of the stigma, you know, that people didn't want to come and, you know, be like, I'm poor and I need to sit in a warm space with other people. So it's like, when it works well, it's like it's often badged as something else. So it's not badged as a poverty project or an in-work poverty project or something like that. It's badged as, let's do something together that's positive, you know. Just think about like yourself. Like, that's what I always think about. It's like, would I want to go and sit in a warm space for no reason? Like, would you? Like, no, of course you wouldn't. Like, but if somebody said to me, like, could you help us out with this knitting project? We're going to raise some money for like soldiers, or we're going to do something like in our community. There was like, they did these World War II memorial, like making poppies, or like they were doing these knitted seaside things or whatever. And but really, it was about social connectedness, and it was about giving people access to food and warm spaces and things like that. But actually, it had a purpose. So people then went into it feeling like they were doing something positive and giving back to others. The thing I would want as my message for people in the Northeast and beyond is strength is there within our communities. But as decision makers, as policy makers, we need to build trust with those communities, because they often, not just those communities, with people, we need to see people's strengths and we need to empower people. And that might involve like working with people over a long time. It may be coming with money and building up people's ability to address this agenda, basically.